Hello, everybody. My name is Gilda Ross. I'm the Glenbard Student and Community Projects Coordinator. I have been so looking forward to this conversation for a very, very long time. I am glad that you are here. I know there are watch parties going on at several places around the county in Elmhurst and elsewhere in Downers Grove, and I'm so happy that you are here. Our ask of those of you that are listening in is to share this resource. The GPS Parent Series is for everyone, everywhere, neighbors next door, across the street, or family and friends across the country. So please like us, share, and let others know that we're here. I want to thank the sponsors who make this all possible, like the health department. Chris Hoff is representing the health department today. They've been a partner right from the very start, about 30 years ago. Thank you for the gift of your time. Quickly, before we begin, I want to tell you very quickly about the upcoming programs that we have lined up. So going into December, we're going to be welcoming Dr. Emily Edlin. Her book is called Autonomy Supportive Parenting, and we'll be talking about how to reduce parent burnout and raise competent kids. At noon, Emily will be in person at the College of DuPage. You can watch virtually as well at noon or at 7 p.m. That is on Wednesday, the 4th. And then the next week, and actually the next night, we'll be talking about how to make college a reality, particularly for students of color. So you'll want to be listening to that. And that's on Thursday, the 5th. Anna Hamayun has a new book out called Erasing the Finish Line. What are the essential skills for true success? Yes, better grades. Yes, less stress. Yes, more free time, but really raising good human beings as well. Then we finish up the month of December. We'll be talking about how to prepare students with disabilities for success at college. That's on Wednesday, December 11th, noon and 7 p.m. And I know you want to share these programs with others. So quickly, let's get into it. We have so much to talk about. It's just an honor to welcome our two speakers today. We have hosted Nic's father, David, many times, and once even with Jessica in conversation, and we knew we just wanted to do it again. So introducing today is Chris Hoff. He's the Deputy Director of the DuPage County Health Department. Deputy Director of Public Health for the DuPage County Health Department. So Chris, please take it away.
Thanks, Gilda. Hi, everybody. The health department is proud to partner with GPS, Nic, and Jessica to share today's story that recovery is possible. We know that mental health and substance use affects all of us in some way, whether those are friends, family members, colleagues, students. And so having Nic here today is a really great opportunity to talk about the road to recovery. Today, we're privileged to have Nic join us to tell his raw and honest story to our GPS audience. Nic is an American writer and the author of two memoirs, including the New York Times bestseller, Tweak, Growing Up on Methamphetamines, and We All Fall Down, Living with Addiction. He spares no detail in telling us the compelling, heartbreaking, and true story of his addiction, relapse, and road to recovery. He's also written several novels for young adults and is a story editor and producer. His father's memoir about him, Beautiful Boy, was the basis of the film Beautiful Boy, starring Steve Carell and Timothée Chalamet. David Sheff, Nic's father, has presented for GPS on several occasions, and we're delighted now to welcome his son, Nic. Nic will be in conversation with Jessica Lahey, the author of the New York Times bestselling book, The Gift of Failure, How the Best Parents Learn to Let Go so Their Children Can Succeed, and The Addiction Inoculation, Raising Healthy Kids in a Culture of Dependence. Lahey was awarded the Research Society on Alcohol's Media Award for outstanding journalistic efforts of writers who cover empirical research on alcohol for her powerful book and advocacy for the recovery community. It's an honor to host them both today for this important GPS conversation, and I so appreciate having them here with us today. Jessica?
Hello. And I actually was racing around my office while the introductions were happening because I heartily recommend Autonomy Supportive Parenting. And my copy of Erasing the Finish Line is in the hands of one of my neighbors who wanted to borrow it. So they're in there. I highly recommend the next two presentations. They're fantastic. And Nic, you are muted.
I'm ready to go. Hi, I'm Nic. I'm excited to be here. Really an honor, and just also we're really looking forward to answering any questions you all might have. I'm sure Jessica, you were about to say this, but you can put them into the chat, or we'll be taking them after the conversation as well.
Yeah, we'll keep the Q&A up and we'll keep the chat up so you can ask questions either places, and we will try to answer those as we go along. And essentially, Nic, I wanted to start with a little bit about your story. I know you've told this a bajillion times, but I want to sort of just talk a little bit about how old you were when you got started using. And then because I love in other interviews, you've given such a great answer to and rebuttal to what a lot of people think is the reason kids start using. And I would love for you to get into that just a little bit.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I was pretty young when I started using for the first time, but it really wasn't something that seemed like a really big deal to me. Growing up, I grew up in the Bay Area, and pot really was like everywhere there back then. I mean, I think it's probably more that way now because of legalization and everything, but yeah, pot was like omnipresent. Like my parents' friends smoked pot, people would smoke pot walking down the street. So I didn't think it was that big of a deal when a friend of mine brought some pot to school that he'd stolen from his older brother and asked me if I wanted to do it. And we went, down to the park near our school after school, and I did it for the first time. And I was really, sort of surprised by my reaction to it because I got this like very immediate sense of relief from the drug. I think up until that point, I'd always felt so anxious and uncomfortable in my own skin and insecure. And I remember, looking around at all the other kids in my class and just feeling like they seemed so confident and so together. And I didn't feel that way at all. I really felt like an alien. And so smoking pot that first time, it really took those feelings away, and it made me feel like I was okay for the first time or something. And so I really loved the feeling it gave me. And from then on, I basically, tried to do that drug as much as I possibly could. And I had a very similar experience when I drank alcohol for the first time, actually, which was not that much later, where it really felt like, oh, this is going to be the answer to my problems. And, this is like almost like the medicine that I've been needing. And yeah, I kind of didn't want to stop once I started, even at that young age.
Can I interject 1 second? So when I talk to kids about, I mean, as someone who's also in recovery, I've been in recovery for 11 and a half years, and alcohol was my drug of choice. Thank you. I didn't have that same feeling. Like one of the things that happens a lot to people when they first sort of tentatively stick their big toe in the world of recovery, or even thinking about trying to get better, is often if their stories don't match your story or my story, you're like, oh, well, I'm not as bad, or that's not how it was for me. But your response of like, either it felt like a lock in the key, and or it was the instructions that everyone else seemed to have to life, and I didn't have those. So that response is really fascinating to me, because that wasn't my experience. My experience simply was, I was really anxious, and somewhere along the way, a little bit of wine in the evening turned into all of the wine every day. And so I think it's really important that, especially for adolescents, that it doesn't always go exactly the same way, but it's a really interesting story you tell. And the reason I said that you had done an interesting rebuttal to what a lot of people assume is, most parents assume that the peer cohort is the biggest risk factor for kids, and that it's peer pressure and you're just trying to be cool. And I've heard you say that that's not exactly what it was for you.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I think my dad has talked about this, that there's a study that he read that interviewed a lot of parents, asking them why they think that why they think young people use drugs. And the overwhelming response to that from parents was peer pressure, wanting to be cool. But when they asked kids that same question, why they use drugs, the answer was almost like complete. I mean, one of the biggest answer was stress and a response to stress. So I think that is, it's interesting because it's not what I think parents think, or it's not what we're sort of taught is the reason that young people are gravitating towards drugs. We are sort of presented with this idea that it is much more about like peer pressure and being cool and stuff. But I think, a reaction to stress or anxiety is actually much more common than people think.
Well, and I think that some of the things we know don't work for kids are whether it's scared straight or, that sort of flat, the catch-all drugs are bad. Whereas for a kid like you, you're like, well, no, they're not, because this is making me feel so much better. Could you talk a little bit about sort of in your brain and how your brain was at the time, why this actually was a really great short-term answer for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think because of, like I said, just the sort of anxiety that I felt that anxiety is such a interesting sort of thing, because I feel like when I was growing up, no one talked about anxiety. Like people talked about depression maybe, or, other things, but I feel like anxiety was not a word that I really heard that often. But that was my predominant feeling, was just this anxiousness. And so, like I said, when I started smoking pot, when I started drinking, it took that anxiety away. And so it was just a huge relief. And at the time, I definitely never thought that I could ask anyone for help or talk about what I was going through with anyone, because I didn't think they would understand. And I also thought that, even if they did understand, there wasn't anything anyone could do to fix me or to make me feel better. So it really did feel like my only solution was going to be drugs and alcohol, because that was the only thing I'd ever found that worked.
So drugs start to escalate from, just down at the park to daily use.
Mm-hmm.
And then you escalate your substances as well, correct?
Yeah. And, the one that really kind of escalated the most quickly and did the most damage the most quickly was when I started doing crystal meth. And for me at the time, like I literally had never heard of crystal meth when I did it for the first time. It was before Breaking Bad. It was before all these sort of ad campaigns to educate people about how dangerous crystal meth is. So I was just at a party. I'd experimented with other drugs. Someone offered me some speed, they called it, and I did it for the first time. And, that feeling that I had the first time I smoked pot, when I did crystal meth, it was like that, but times a billion. I just felt so confident and like I could just do anything, like I was like a rock star or something. And I was instantly addicted to it. And the moment that I did that drug for the first time, my life started to spiral out of control very, very, very quickly. And then, yeah, it was just sort of consequence on top of consequence. And, I eventually started using intravenous drugs. And I mean, I had issues with opiates, with cocaine, but crystal meth was really the one, with pills, benzodiazepines, Xanax and stuff. But yeah, crystal meth was really the one that like kicked it all off, and the one that kind of changed my personality so much when I started doing it. And I really, from a very, I would say like a kind, caring, kind of loving person, I became someone that, I didn't recognize, and that, my family didn't recognize, when I was stealing from them and breaking into people's houses and just doing incredibly destructive things to get more money, to get the drugs that I felt like I needed in order to be okay.
Which you did. I mean, to be fair, and for the parents in the audience who are listening to this, and just this idea of crystal meth, it's this scary, dark thing. Let's back up for a second and talk about what crystal meth is. And for kids so it is an amphetamine, crystal methamphetamine. And that word amphetamine is in there because it is, as someone told you, a type of speed. And for kids who have, for example, attention issues, attention hyperactive ADHD, it is actually the key to their lock. And it is a version of that, a slightly different version of that is used therapeutically. So it makes perfect sense that if your brain is in some sort of imbalance, that if you introduce something to it that we actually know helps therapeutically helps restore balance, that of course at that point, it becomes something that you need and crave and will go to just about any lengths to get. Alcohol became something that I had zero control over. I was crossing all kinds of boundaries that I said I would never, ever cross. And I tell people, I mean, seems like this is why doing comparisons in recovery is such a bad idea, because this sounds like such a small thing. But I'm one of those people who likes to pick up litter along the side of the road, and I live in Vermont. I want it to be beautiful, and I started littering because I couldn't take the beer cans or the wine bottles home. So then I would pay, I'd make amends to myself and to the side of the road by going back and picking up mine and other people's stuff and saying, look what a good person I am. I'm picking up trash. But it's these weird lines in the sand that suddenly you're just willingly crossing because your brain is saying, no, but I really, really need that thing.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was speaking at to a bunch of high school students recently, and one of the kids asked me, like, "Do you think you'll ever be able to just like drink, and control yourself?" Was what she said, which was funny. And for me, obviously, I know that I can't because I'm someone that has this brain disorder, brain disease, and it is like an invisible switch gets flipped. Like once I put a mind altering substance into my body, and it really doesn't matter what it is, like any mind altering substance, that invisible switch gets flipped, and I can't stop. But I also can't, it's more than like, I mean, it is that I can't stop, but it's also that I can't stop thinking about it. So there was a moment for me where I was out of treatment. I was trying not to do any hard drugs, and I thought, oh, well, maybe I can drink because I never really had a problem with just alcohol before. So I started, drinking just like a beer or whatever. But as soon as I drank that beer, it's like, it's really hard to explain, but it's like this obsession just starts in my mind. And I knew, like, I don't want to have a problem with alcohol, so I don't want to just drink more and more and more. So I was able to like go home after that one beer and not drink again that day, but I was just constantly thinking about it. And then the next day I went and had another beer, and then that was when I had the second beer, and then it just escalated from there. But it's this weird like obsession in my mind that is very hard to explain to people, but it's very real, and it does feel very common with people who have this disease.
Well, what's funny is, so for 5 years, I worked in a drug and alcohol rehab for adolescents, and they can be an extremely critical lot when it comes to books around substance use, anything that feels preachy. And that's why I recommend Nic and David's book constantly. It's the reason that I take it with me to every single speaking event. I recommend it constantly because even my students at the rehab would pick this book up and read it and like, yeah, they get it. This is good. And there is no harsher critic of a book like this than a teenager in rehab.
Well, thank you.
So I wanted to say,
I feel like that was
passed the test.
Thank you. I will say that speaking event that I did in front of like 500 high school kids or something, I was like way more nervous to do that than I was to speak to most crowds out there, because they are really it's hard to keep their attention, and they are very cynical about a lot of things. But it's amazing to hear. I think one thing that people are becoming more and more aware of, as I think we've done a better job of sort of educating young people about, is the prevalence of mental health issues in our society. And I mentioned that I didn't think that I would that if I asked someone for help, they would have been able to help me at the time. But I know now that that's not true, that if I had reached out for help when I was in high school, when I was in middle school, there are people that I've met that are working in communities all across the country who really do make a difference in helping young people to deal with these anxiety issues, with these mental health issues, with depression, and change their lives so that they don't need to go down the same kind of path that I went down.
I actually want to jump off of that, but in just a second. But there's a really fantastic question in the chat that I want to address really quickly. So this is such a great question. The question in the chat is, when you need surgery or dental care, are you able to use prescribed pain reducers, or does that open a door to relapsing? And this is a really individual question. So I would love it if we could both answer this.
Yeah. I'm curious what you're
so
answering.
so I live in fear of getting hurt, because I know that even, and luckily I have a husband, a very supportive husband who is a physician, and he would have to be in charge of keeping that medication for me. And I would ask, even though I don't know, that I would try to find it and take extra, that he keep it in a lockbox. That would be my preference. When both of my children, who have a genetic predisposition for substance use disorder, when it comes to the risk picture, genetics is about 50 to 60% of the risk picture. My kids are more likely than other kids to develop substance use disorder. So both of them have had dentistry done. Both of them have had their wisdom teeth out. And both times the dentist immediately, the oral surgeon immediately handed over the antibiotics and the opiates prescription. And I said, we're not going to be filling this. We'll take it in case of emergency, but we probably won't be filling this. And then as soon as they were sort of past, my kids were past the point of needing, like, that something bad could happen, like dry socket or something, we burned it. And we burned it together, because I think part of helping, and then, you know, at a certain point when they had a little bit of pain, we would do ibuprofen or Tylenol. And I think doctors and oral surgeons are getting a lot better about not automatically reaching for the opiates, but it's something that it's a reality that if I was to have surgery, that someone would have to very much be in charge of those medications for me, even though opiates has never been my problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I feel the same way for sure. It would be scary for me. And like, I did have a surgery that was, you know, kind of optional to have pain meds afterwards. And I opted not to, because it just seemed like a slippery slope that I didn't want to go there. But I get, the only thing I would say that is been interesting is like, I do feel like the obsession for me, because of the work that I do, you know, in the 12 steps, because of the work that I do with my therapists and, you know, blah, 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 like the obsession for me is not there. So like, my wife is a normal person. She drinks, she has, you know, I just had a baby, or she just had a baby 4 months ago, and had to have some pain medication after that. And, you know, that was like in the house. And, I don't even think about it at all. So that doesn't bother me. But the thing is, I know that if I took one of those pain medications, like because I needed it after a surgery or something, then that phenomenon of craving would get triggered. That invisible switch would get flipped. And so that's when it gets really scary, because I don't want that switch to get flipped. And so that's where, you know, as much as possible, I've tried to avoid it. And if I did for some reason have to take it, I agree, I would ask my wife to, you know, hold on to it for me, you know, give it to me when I needed it, and then get rid of it right afterwards.
This is actually related to a question I get a lot, which is, does this mean I can't drink in front of my kids if I'm trying to set a good example? And that in our house, what we've opted to do is there's never open alcohol at our house. So my husband will get singles or whatever and finish them. And I think same as, you know, the reason I mentioned the lockbox and the reason I mentioned that we don't keep open alcohol in our house is that I don't know that I would think about it, but also he doesn't want that to be something I have to worry about either. So that's been our solution in our house. But again, this is all highly individual, and, you know, and I think at the same time, we also discuss it in front of our kids constantly, like why we don't keep open alcohol in the house and that sort of thing. So it's been, I've learned a lot about, I fancy myself to be the kind of person who is in control all the time. Thank you very much. And I don't need any help. But sometimes I'm not. And so I don't want to have to think about it if I'm not. So
yeah, it's interesting. Well, and obviously, I just to keep, but you know, now that I have a child of my own, my first child, now, you know, it is something I'm really going to have to think about. And so it is interesting to hear, you know, your sort of the things that you thought of.
There's a book about it. There's a whole book about, and actually, because I am, you know, because my kids were born with an elevated genetic risk.
Yes, exactly. As mine will be too, or are too. Yeah.
I might be able to get you a copy, Nick. I'll see. I'll see what I can do. So I want to move on to the other big question I get is parents thinking there's a possibility that their kids might be A, using, or B, have crossed that line over into, you know, something akin to misuse, but are also really scared to say anything. And I would love, because I know that your dad has talked openly about the fact that, he didn't say anything for a long time and then he did. So can you talk a little bit about sort of that? Sometimes we feel like it's a really tenuous connection. And if we do anything to upset them, then they're just going to shut us out.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I mean, there's an addiction or a substance use disorder specialist that I heard speak, and he was saying, as a parent, basically, if you think there's a problem, then just the fact that you have that thought makes it valid that you sort of get help for your child, or at least or intervene in some way, because parents do need to trust their instincts, and as parents they are sort of you are sort of the best judge of what's going on with your kid, and so the fact that you're concerned means that there's something to go dive into there and explore and not ignore. And I think for my dad, he definitely wishes that he hadn't ignored the signs and had intervened earlier. And as scary as it is, I've seen that those early interventions really do work, and they really do make a difference, and it really is possible to get young people to even before they've had to like hit bottom or go to these lengths of destruction of their lives, they're able to help them sort of turn their lives around and get help with for the underlying issues that are causing the problem in the first place. So yeah, I feel like from what I say is like err on the side of caution.
You and I have used the same analogy. There was another an interview I saw that you did where you talked about the puzzle, that is, getting to recovery. And I use that same analogy also to scoop up a lot of prevention stuff, because like I can't guarantee that my kids will, I wrote this book about preventing substance use in kids, and yet I can't guarantee if I do every single thing that the research says I should be doing, that my kids aren't going to end up with substance use disorder. But at the same time, if getting to recovery is like a 100-piece puzzle, then all of that prevention stuff and all of that information about how their brain works and what substances do to it and why substance use is different during adolescence than it is during adulthood, those are all pieces of the puzzle. Mm-hmm. So that if they are to start to go down that road, then I may have started on piece 36 when alcohol started to become a problem for me, but hopefully they can be on like piece 64. And the catch is you hardly ever get to be piece 100. My dad happened to be piece 100 for me when I was ready to get help. But all those other pieces, 1 through 99, had to be there in order for my dad's final piece to slip into place. And I love that analogy, because that means that even the mistakes, even for you, relapse is a part of your story as well. And I think those are all really important pieces of your recovery puzzle as well. Can you talk a little bit about how you tend to think about relapse, and especially relapse in younger adults?
Yeah, I mean, everything you just said, I really agree with, and I think is so important, because there is this feeling, I think, when someone relapses, or when if someone's having a problem as a young person or whatever, that it's like it all didn't work and it was all a failure, and
we failed. It's never going to.
Yeah, exactly. But really, it is. I mean, it is about sort of like they say in the 12-step program, progress, not perfection, or whatever. And it is about sort of learning and gaining knowledge and information about ourselves and about our loved ones that we're trying to help. And so sort of the more kind of armor that we can help our loved ones put on, the better protected they will be. And yeah, for me, I feel like each, when I would go to treatment and then I would relapse afterwards, I never went back to square one. I never went back to the way that I was before I went to treatment the first time. I learned a little bit more. I gained a little bit more knowledge. I had a little bit more experience, so that the next time when I was trying to get sober, I had more of the tools that I was going to need to ultimately get to the point where I could like get sober and then stay sober, hopefully for the rest of my life. So it is sometimes a 2 steps forward, 1 step back process. Sometimes it's a one step forward, two steps back process, but it is a moving forward process to get to that 100 pieces like you talked about. That's a great analogy.
I actually have a text on my phone, right? Text thread on my phone right now from someone I knew in childhood who came to talk to me once they saw that I was working in this space. And, it took a while for them to sort of explain why they'd gotten back in touch. And then finally they explained it. And, this person has had, a whole bunch of relapses. And so my common reply to his texts of, his sheepish, I messed up, is okay. What did we learn this time? How did you get there? What where was your brain when you were sort of in the days before this? And what are you going to take with you that, that will help you identify that next time? And I think it's all really, really important. And just for the record, young adults and adolescents tend to have relapse as a bigger part of their picture because their brains are not done developing yet. The human brain's not done developing until the early to mid 20s. And so the idea that they're going to get it perfectly the first time, I think it would make a lot of parents feel more hopeful if they knew that it was a process it was a process, not just an end point and now we're done. And
yeah. And I will say, there was a moment when my relapses were getting worse and worse and worse. But then at a certain point, when I started to relapse, I was able to not go as far down as I'd gone before. And I was able to ask for help before I lost everything and before, I did so much damage to myself and to the people that loved me. So there was progress in that, and I was talking to someone who had a long period of time sober and then relapsed, and they were saying, they felt like it kind of negated that whole period of sobriety that they had, which of course it doesn't. We're none of us are perfect, and it's all about sort of doing the best we can, and trying as hard as we can, and sometimes we mess up, and it is it's a disease, it's a brain disease. So just like with any disease, there can be relapses, and so you have to just pick up the pieces and try again and not get discouraged.
I want to segue into another question we got in the Q&A that's fantastic. And by way of segueing into that, I want to do two things. So I think the more parents and people, especially people who don't experience substance use disorder, can understand about the fact that our brains work differently, the more helpful it can be to sort of have that empathy and do a little perspective taking. But also, every time I talk to a parent who's really, really frustrated with their adolescent, I tell them to just look right here, right between their eyes, because that's the part of the brain that's not connected yet. And so I think the more you understand about the adolescent brain, the better you're able to have some patience with the adolescent brain. So I'm big fan of Dan Siegel's book, Brainstorm, big fan of Larry Steinberg's book, Age of Opportunity. And then if you want to understand a little bit about what Nic was talking about that obsessive thinking and about that up and down sort of feeling in the brain, Anna Lemke's Dopamine Nation is also a really great book for understanding the circuitry that sort of happens in substance use. So someone asked, Mila asked, can you recommend some coping skills for teens that experience similar anxiety or are looking to build themselves up without substances? Such a good question. To some degree, kids may grow through that as they mature, but coping skills would be great. And I'm going to let you go first, but I definitely have some stuff to add at the end.
Yeah, I think, reaching out to people, experts in the community who work in this field and can really make a difference and help. I know, I've seen people, or like my friends' kids who are in high school who are struggling, and if they help get them into the right kind of therapy, or even talking to the guidance counselors at school, getting into DBT therapy, like learning skills, all these things can really have a big impact and help young people who are dealing with issues related to anxiety and self-esteem and all that stuff. So I really think it is about reaching out, asking for help. I know there's something about our society that we're sort of taught in a way that we have to do everything on our own. And I think that's so destructive. The more we can reach out and ask for help, the more we can take advantage of the help that's out there, because it is, I always like to say, like, the work works. Like, it's a lot of work that you have to do to change and get better, whether that's from substance use disorder or, having anxiety or other, mental health issues. But when you do that work and work with, other people who are helping you, the work works. And so that's the really cool thing to be able to share.
So when we talk about you're talking about asking for help, and I think there's some allies that parents tend not to think of. I mean, guidance counselors at school counselors is what we're supposed to call them now, school nurses. What some people don't realize is that pediatricians and people who treat children, whether that's family docs, pediatricians, all that sort of thing, they have these incredible screening tools that we're using now, whether that's this one called SBIRT, which is screening, brief intervention, and referral to treatment. And these, the pediatricians or the PA or whoever you're seeing can become this long-term sort of a person who can look at the risk that that your kid is talking about, which makes it really important that you give kids space when they're doing that little questionnaire right before their doctor's appointment. Give them some space, because they're not going to be grading you on your parenting. And also make sure that your kid starts to get alone time with their physician as they get older, as they move into puberty, because there's going to be things that they may talk about with their physician that they won't talk about you, like getting into the car with a drunk driver, feeling safe when they're dating, that kind of stuff. And these allies, there's even more of them, I think, than we tend to think about immediately. And school counselors and school nurses can often give you information around community resources that have sliding scale, because we need therapy. I think everybody needs therapy, and it can be hard to come by. So there are resources within your school district and your community that can get you help finding those things.
Yeah. That's a really good point. I mean, I really found that, like, the more you pay for treatment or therapy or anything does not equal the better treatment you're going to, or therapy or whatever you're going to get. It's really like it doesn't work that way at all. Some of the best programs are the programs that are county run or that, have sliding scale or whatever. It really is, the financial aspect shouldn't be a barrier to getting help.
Well, and in terms of knowing whether or not the therapist or the program that you're using is any good, there are great resources for finding out whether or not programs are any good. University of Colorado at Boulder has this website called Blueprints, and you can go there and you can find out whether the program your school is using is actually evidence-based, because unfortunately only 57% of high schools in this country have any substance use prevention program. And of that 57%, only about 10% are based on evidence of efficacy. So we can do better. And what we know, and one other really great tool is social emotional learning in schools. It's getting, unfortunately, politics has latched itself onto the term social emotional learning. And there are some places in this country where when I go there to talk about SEL and how important it is for kids to develop understanding of how their brain works and their emotions and being able to talk about their emotions, it's getting a bad rap in some places, but it's actually one of the most important things that we can do for kids, is give them a language to talk about their emotions. And some of the stuff that you were experiencing, Nic, just not feeling like you fit in the world. That's a really important, there's a saying, you have to be able to name it to tame it. So having the words for those is really important. Nic, could you speak a little bit to the, what about kids who think that marijuana can't be addictive?
Yeah, I saw that. Well, it's not true. And maybe that goes to the point about education, which I really do think that the more education that we give young people about, substance use disorder. I didn't know anything about, sort of addiction when I was growing up. Like, my grandfather on my mom's side literally drank himself to death and died in like a VA hospital. And but I never knew growing up that, like, because I had a grandfather who had alcoholism, that meant that I was more at risk potentially for developing a substance use disorder, because I just didn't know anything about that concept of addiction being a disease or substance use disorder being a disease. So the more we can sort of educate young people, the better. And yeah, the idea that, you know, pot isn't addictive is just not true. And there's a lot of, I mean, I've been in treatment with people who were just there for, you know, because of smoking, you know, marijuana. So I've seen the fact that it's not true. And we just have to, you know, work hard to educate young people and combat the misinformation that's out there.
What's been interesting to me is there's been this movement, whether it's dry January or sober October, to sort of give people the opportunity to, in like a socially acceptable, not dorky way, you know, take a break. And I just wanted to give props to this guy, Tom Fontana at University of Vermont, did this amazing book for people who want to do what he calls a tea break, a tolerance break for THC, for weed, for cannabis. And, you know, he acknowledges in this, like he gives little hints for like every day and what it might be like during those 28 or 30 days that you're giving up cannabis and what you might experience. And, you know, it's simply not true that it's not addictive. And it's not addictive in the same way. Your brain definitely craves the experience, though, of cannabis. And actually, that's a great segue into the question about, can you talk more about youth with ADHD, learning differences and the like, and their predisposition to substance use? What are you watching for? I'm not sure, Nick, where you are with your knowledge in this wheelhouse. I'm happy to take it. I'm happy to defer.
Yeah, you start with that.
Okay. All right. So this is an emerging field of study. Okay. So the best information we have right now is the number one, that yes, kids who have learning differences are at higher risk for substance use disorder. We also know kids that are aggressive towards other kids or that have social ostracism going on in their lives can also be at greater risk for substance use disorder. But all of those things kind of can get tangled up, right? Like if you are being socially ostracized, there's also a good chance that you're going to experience academic failure, or you're going to experience, you know, some of these other things. So early intervention is the name of this game. We also know that for kids who have ADHD, for example, that if their ADHD is not managed or they're undiagnosed, their risk for substance use disorder goes up. Substance use and substance use disorder goes up. But if they are well managed and they're getting support and they're managed either medically or also with therapy, that their risk actually goes down. So that's good news for the parents of people with ADHD. And learning differences in general, I think what we're starting to mostly see is that you know, genetics is about 50 to 60% of the risk picture, but the experiences that we have as kids make up, and the trauma and toxic stress. And there's a lot of stress and toxic stress and predispositions to, for example, lack of impulse control that can be inherent in some of those learning differences or neuroatypical kids. So it really depends is the big answer to that question. There's actually a wonderful book called The Child Code by Danielle Dick, where she talks about the genetic basis for a lot of children's personality things like impulse, low impulse control, that kind of stuff. And understanding your kid's personality, which can very much be tied into their genetics, can be really helpful for knowing very specifically your kid. If you have a kid who's like who just an adrenaline junkie and needs to feel more in order to feel something, I would be watching a little more closely.
So, yeah, the only thing I would add to that is just from a personal perspective, like I, know there's a lot of parents out there who are resistant to putting their kids on medication. And, I get that, like it's a scary thing to do, but I can just say, I've been diagnosed with bipolar disorder, depression, the medication, talk about the puzzle, getting on the right medication was definitely a puzzle piece for me, and a big puzzle piece. And, I do wish, ultimately that when I was younger in high school, when I was starting to like show signs of this, that I had gotten on medication. I think it would have really changed things for me and in a positive way. And, I've seen my friends with kids, struggle with attention deficit disorder, got them on medication, and, it's really transformed their kids' lives. So as much as it is a scary thing, I think, it is something that really, really can make a big difference, as you just said.
Yeah, I think our brains can all be quite different. And so, you have to do what's right for you, but within that context, being well managed in your learning difference or in your attention difference or in your neuroatypicality actually tends to be protective against substance use disorder. And just while we're on the topic of kids, neurodiverse kids, there's a wonderful resource, Debbie Reber's Tilt Parenting website. Debbie is my favorite resource, and not only just a resource of knowledge, but she also has created an incredible community over there of parents with kids who are neurodiverse. And they talk about, that's a space where, you can talk about those things. And what you said, Nic, is that I think we're acquiring the ability through saying, there's no room for stigma, there's no room for shame. We can't feel guilty about these things. We have to talk about what's going on in our minds and our bodies. And what I've seen among people saying, oh, these kids today, they're so weak, and they just are always talking about being like they can't handle stuff. But I actually think that this current generation of kids is fantastic because they have a language for knowing what their mental and emotional needs are that we did not have access to. So I'm rah, the current crop of kids in high school and middle school and high school.
Yeah, it's interesting. And being able to name it, like you said, there's a real power in that. And like I was saying, with anxiety, even that's such a simple thing. I think if I'd been able to be like, oh, I have a lot of anxiety, like that would have been helpful for me to be able to say it. But I didn't even have that vocabulary to know what I was experiencing.
There's a wonderful resource. Lori Gottlieb, who wrote the book, Maybe You Should Talk to Somebody, a very popular book about therapy. Her son, Zach Gottlieb, created a website called Talk with Zach, and he's also on Instagram. And his whole point is, why on earth are we afraid to talk about this stuff? Like, it's widespread. Everyone I know is dealing with stress and worry and anxiety and stomach aches and, feeling like they're not enough. And so it's insane that we're not talking about these things. Sorry to use the word insane, but it's just ridiculous that we're not allowed to talk about these things. And so he, as a high school student, he came out and he said, okay, I'm going to make a space where it's okay for us to talk about these things. So I'm a big fan of Talk with Zach. I think it's great. Kids are really leading the way on being able to talk about these things and making it okay. In fact, my favorite part of addiction inoculation, I didn't even write. It was suggestions from adolescents if they were out and they didn't want to use, how could they save face and yet still say no and feel like they hadn't, knowing that no is still a complete sentence. They gave me like 2.5 pages of really cool excuses for why they didn't want to use. And, that sort of giving each other the empowerment to do that sort of stuff, I think has been invaluable to watch. Your baby's coming into a pretty cool world, I think, in terms of social emotional learning and pro-social behaviors and the ability to speak up for yourself. So I'm excited about that. So we have about 12 minutes left. If you have any questions, I think it would be great to get those in there. Nic, can I ask you really quickly about your earlier books? So you wrote 2 books, one at about the same time your dad was writing A Beautiful Boy, one of which you were kind of sort of sober, and one where you finally got sober. And can you talk a little bit about those books?
Yeah, it was sort of interesting because I was sober for a little while, living at a sober living, and I started writing these short stories that I was just like submitting to random magazines because, my dad is a writer. I grew up really admiring him as a writer. And one of the things that did make me feel sort of less alone and less like an alien when I was growing up was reading books by authors who were very honest about their, sort of inner lives and what was going on with them in a way that, people on the street aren't. So that made me feel like I wanted to be a part of that conversation and share my own story. So yeah, I was writing these short stories and submitting them to online magazines. And then at that same time, my dad, who, like I said, is a journalist, came to me with the idea of writing an article for the New York Times Magazine about our family's journey with addiction, specifically to crystal meth addiction. And, it was scary to think about putting our story out there, and he was going to use my name and his name and everything, but I also felt like if it would potentially help people to not go through what we'd gone through, or educate people about the dangers of these drugs, of crystal meth in particular, that would be useful. So he went ahead and he wrote the article, and in the article he talked about how I was sober, and I'd been writing these short stories for an online magazine, or for online magazine. So anyway, then a editor from a publishing company in New York read my short stories, and she reached out to me about expanding those into a book. And I was really excited about it, because it felt like it would be an opportunity to really connect with people in the same way that my dad's article did. The crazy thing was, I ended up relapsing halfway through writing that book, Tweak, and my dad had decided to expand his article into the book that eventually became Beautiful Boy. But after relapsing, I was in treatment. And then when I got out of treatment, I decided that I didn't want to really I wanted to wait to reconnect with my family until I'd been sober for a year, because I'd relapsed so many times, and I just didn't want to build up that relationship again just to let them down. And so I went for a whole year without speaking to my family. And during that time, I finished writing my book. And when I reached out to my dad again after a year of sobriety, I told him, I've been sober for a year and I finished writing this book. And he was like, oh, well, that article that I wrote, I expanded into a book, and that is finished too. So we had this amazing opportunity of sending each other the two books. And it was really powerful. I think for me, reading my dad's book, I got to see, how much my actions affected the people that loved me. And it really changed things for me. I saw that I didn't live in a vacuum. My addiction really almost, destroyed my dad's family, and it was devastating. And then for him, he talks about how reading Tweak, he always had this idea that when I was relapsing, it was because I was out partying, having fun. But he got to see reading the book that it wasn't about having fun. It wasn't about partying. I was just in a ton of pain. I would try to reach out to the drugs and alcohol to try to feel better. And then that invisible switch would flip and I couldn't stop. So I think it changed things for both of us, and in a really powerful way. And it was a great experience.
I think writing this stuff down and putting it out there for public consumption, in my book, actually in the introduction, my husband found out a whole bunch of new information that he hadn't known before, like my rituals and how I hid things, and my parents and cousins and stuff like that. But I will say, for me anyway, and I was going to ask you about, your experience being publicly sober, but for me anyway, I think it's how it, number one, has kept me honest. Number two, radical honesty in recovery, I think, is a really important thing, mainly because we're really good liars. People who have had substance use disorder were really good liars. And so learning how to tell the truth is a really important part of this journey. And so and that's by way of thanking you for this, because every single time you tell your story, and you get to tell it a lot, it helps another person. And we don't often get to see them, but it's an incredible journey that you've been on, and it's incredibly helpful to so many people.
Well, thank you. And yeah, I would say then the cool thing was my dad and I got to then go on this whole book tour around the country. And then when the movie came out, we did it again. And so we've as I'm sure you have, we've met literally tens of thousands of people all across the country who had the exact same story, basically, that our family did, where, they had completely given up hope almost that things could ever get better. And we got to see the way that families were able to rebuild, and people were able to build back their lives, and really transform after getting sober to live these full, beautiful lives. And so that message of hope, and seeing that hope, all across the country, I've been to all 50 states at this point, is really a cool. It's unbelievable. And it's a great thing to be able to share too.
I just got back from the Middle East, where the first time I went there to speak, I was told, don't talk about substance use. That's not something we want you to talk about. And this time when I went back, people brought it up to me, which even in places like that where alcohol is, and there's a huge divide between public and private, I'm seeing change. I'm seeing shifts. And actually, I know we need to close up, and we have 6 minutes left, but I want to make sure that Chris and Gilda have time at the end. But I did want to hold up one of my very favorite books that I have not mentioned yet, which is your dad's other book, Clean. I hated it, clearly. In fact, for a little while there, I had cut it in half so I could carry part of it with me. So my book's in pieces, as all the best books are. And so I want to recommend Clean as well. Clean goes into more about like treatment and recovery, for example, than my book's just about prevention, but Clean goes into a lot of important information around recovery and prevention and recovery. And especially for adolescents, there are not a lot of places to look for help. And your dad has talked very publicly about being completely lost and not knowing what to do for you, because he didn't have any access, any understanding of what those resources were about. So he shares a lot of the knowledge that he picked up along the way in his research in that book. But I want to turn it back to Gilda and Chris, because I know that there was some housekeeping stuff that we want to do at the end here.
Well, just a thank you, but we also do have a question. So Chris,
Yeah.
I'll let you go first.
I want to just thank you, Nic, for bringing this information and the message of recovery to everyone here. The nearly 1 million people that live in DuPage County need to hear this message, and we are grateful to partner with you on that. Thank you for your bravery, your courage, and sharing your story. And as a new dad, all the best to you in raising a child into a world that you've created a really beautiful space. So thank you, Nic. Thank you, Jessica, for helping to share your story, and we really appreciate both of you. Gilda.
Thank you, Chris. Yes, so many books, so many resources. Don't stop now. I know Nic and Jessica, both of you. Here's a question for you. Nic and Jessica, when you speak to young people, what is your mission? When you speak to adults, what do you want to be sure that they know before you say goodbye?
You want to start, Jessica?
Okay, I'll start. So for me, the most important thing I do is prime conversations. So when I go to schools, I often talk to the kids during the day, and then community and parents in the evening. And so helping the kids know how to approach their parents and talk about difficult topics and open those conversations and use I statements so that people don't get defensive. And then in the evening, I get to say to the parents, if your kid comes to you with these I statements, when you do this, it makes me feel why, that you really need to listen, because this is important. But I also give all the kids my email, and tell them, I'm going to be talking to your parents tonight. What is it you want them to know? And so when I'm able to say to the parents, here are some of the things that your kids told me today, they're not they're not feeling seen, heard, known, loved for who they are. They think you are hoping they're different, that kind of stuff. That priming those conversations, I think, is the most important thing I do. And the one thing I always want parents to know before I leave is that I have effectively busted the myth of, well, kids are going to do it anyway, so they might as well do it in my house, and I'll take their keys away so everyone's safe. That doesn't work. And you're not only raising your kids' risk for substance use disorder over their lifetime, you're raising everyone else's risk, their friends' risk. And that European myth of moderation, like, ooh, if we have sips at home, they'll be like those European moderate drinkers. Also, not a great analogy. The European Union as a whole has the highest rates of illness attributable to alcohol and deaths attributable to alcohol. So not exactly the icon of moderation that we want to hold up.
That's funny. That's a good point. Yeah, I agree. Everything you just said is amazing. And I think just, also just to talk about that there is so much hope out there, that it is really possible to feel better, to change. I really, I wake up in the morning and I feel real joy to be alive, and just, and it's the little things, going for a walk with my dog, going out to dinner with my wife. I enjoy these little things, and that's something that, like, I never ever thought would be possible. So the fact that, you know, recovery is possible, but that being in recovery isn't just about living this second tier consolation prize life. It's like, it really feels like a chance to like be on the winning team or something, you know.
Yeah.
I really love my life in recovery, it's not just me. I've seen that in, you know, tens of thousands of people across this country, which is really cool to share.
I second what Nick said.
Really quickly, one half last question as we close out. You in that book, in Addiction Inoculation, what was your favorite excuse that kids gave for not
Oh my gosh, I
imbibing?
loved all of them. But frankly, just, no is a complete sentence, and you're allowed to say no to anything you want to say no to. Advocating for yourself is one of the most important things we can teach kids. But, everything from, I have a sleep disorder, so I can't drink that, or I can't have gluten, so that beer won't work for me, or I have an early practice in the morning, or frankly, throw me under the bus. Tell someone that your mom drug tests, or that your mom does, checks you for, checks your blood alcohol when you get your alcohol content when you get home. So I'm fine with being the not fun parent, because parents who have a consistent and clear message of no, not until your brain is done developing, have kids with lower levels of substance use and substance use disorder over their lifetime.
Yeah. Would you agree? Nick's agree.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, I like that, making the parent, you know, being as a parent, being willing to be the bad guy, I think is great. I mean, you know, I have a son now. I raised a lot of dogs before that, and you know, dogs, chicken, they all want to know their place, and they want to be able to depend on you know, their parent to feel safe, you know, and I think that's a parent's job. So I really think that's fantastic.
You just talked about dogs, and we talked about this the other day. When you walk in the door and that dog is there wagging its tail, happy to meet you, we're going to try as parents, even in the worst of times, we're going to be the one that they come to for the hard conversations. We're going to be the one that knows them best so they can look for these changes, and we're going to love them for who they are, not for what we hoped for or expected or imagined. So many wonderful points. You really, both of you, made such a difference today. We love you for that. Thank you both so much. Thank you, everyone, for listening. And we'll see you next time. Can't wait to host you both again. Take care, everyone.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Gilda.
Nick. Thanks, Jessica.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks, everyone.
Go hug the kids.
Mhm.